Thanks very much. My name is Bill Rappard, and on behalf of my colleagues from Paydirt Gold Mining Journal, a very warm welcome to Paydirt Unlocked.
As Bill mentioned before, my name is Dominic Piper. I'm editor of Paydirt and Gold Mining Journal and your session chair for this session. I did really enjoy Bill's analogy of the Grand National. Although looking at some of our panelists, I think it might be the first time they've ever been compared to a jockey in their life. Joining us today are four esteemed uranium executives. I'll just introduce them very quickly. To my immediate left is John Borshoff, Managing Director of DPLO Limited. Next to him is Vimy Resources Managing Director, Mike Young. As Bill said, the newest kid on the block, 92 Energy, a brand new listing. Chief Executive Officer, Siobhan Lancaster. And to my extreme left, although not politically, I wouldn't have thought, is Brandon Monroe, Managing Director of Bannerman Resources. So we've got a great mix of talent up here on stage, a mix of companies with projects in Western Australia, Namibia, and Canada. I've got a few questions here, but by all means, in a few moments, once you've been able to eat and have a few more glasses of wine, the microphones will be roaming around the venue. So please put your hand up and we'll get to some questions later on. I'd also like to welcome those people who are joining us on the live stream via Vimeo. We're live streaming this across the globe. And as some of you will know, the Twitter army of investors is very bullish on uranium at the moment. So I've already had a number of Twitter users from North America, Canada in particular, logging into the live stream. So it's very exciting that we're going across the globe with this conversation. And you may notice people live streaming that, yes, this isn't fictional. There's more than 100 people in the room having lunch with no masks and enjoying another day together again. So let's get into things. John, I'm going to start with you as the, if I hope you don't mind me saying, the elder statesman of this group. In the past decade, we've seen a number of mini revivals in the uranium sector that perhaps have burnt out almost as quickly as they've caught fire. It appears that this one might be have more substance to it and longer lasting. Why is that? Why have the circumstances changed this time around?
Well, before I start, I didn't appreciate your black tie, and which makes you look a bit like an undertaker. But back to your question. Look, when I started Paladin, it was a very simple model, really. Nuclear was dead in the water. Chernobyl happened, and essentially China had to build up its electric sort of base, and nuclear was a component of that, along with coal and many others. Simple model, no other sort of disruptive technologies into it, and everybody looked at it as just a pure, get electrification up to 10,000 kilowatt per capita and all that sort of stuff, or whatever the model was. So demand went up on that basis, and now we've got this era, which is a completely different era. That we've got, yes, the catch-up of electricity for the normal people. We've got probably the biggest disruptor since the beginning of the last industrial revolution happening with decarbonisation. And we have models put in there which nobody is yet really fully implicated in terms of what's necessary. So not only do we need more electricity in the developing countries, but now with EV, hydrogen, industrial heat, there is another huge requirement, which is essentially an unknown, and none of the projections going forward predict this at all. They can talk what they like. It was like when you invented the chip and everybody said, oh, we're going to use the chip for this or that, and time sort of got that sorted. So where this puts the real pressure is that the supply side of the industry is essentially a broken down business. It's done nothing for 10 years, and even before that, very mixed. On the juniors, it was only Paladin over the 20 years. And this industry has to really pull itself up by the bootstraps and start, a horrific challenge, which is probably not as prepared for as what it is. Not only for electrification in the normal circumstances, but that footprint of electricity that's going way beyond that. And hydrogen, you name it. And I think the challenges for supply are immense. They're a huge opportunity, and more resources, more exploration is needed to get more resources than is there, because most of these deposits are 20, 30-year-old deposits discovered.
Thanks, John. Mike, I assume you share a similar sentiment. You've been very bullish on the uranium sector for a long time. Has your resolve stiffened, or is your approach changed as well?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been a pro-uranium person since I was 5, when they were building the nuclear power plant at Pickering. So I grew up with it, worked in uranium. I think what we're seeing right now, in terms of, is this another false dawn, which is your question, is no. Mainly because we're in the middle of a sentiment boom. We haven't seen the price supply boom yet, right? So what's happened is you can put the current rise in all the uranium equities, you can put it back to December 3rd, 2020. And that's when a bipartisan bill came out of a US Senate committee to support the nuclear industry in America, 28% of the market. And having the Democrats suddenly flip from being opposed to nuclear, even though Trump was pro-nuclear, there was no bipartisan support. That was a really important event, right? And I jokingly put this on my slides, but just recently, The Edge from U2 has come out supporting nuclear power, right? Now that's important because U2 is one of the wokest bands on earth, right? They really tap into social conscience, right? And so you've had this culmination of social changes with Greta Thunberg and people being scared into climate catastrophism, which as a geoscientist I can tell you is not based in science, but it's driving policy. And then suddenly you've got people going, we need nuclear. We need Chernobyl's or Fukushima's 10 years ago. We need to look at nuclear. And so that's the sentiment boom, and that's what's happened. And you've seen multiple increases in prices of the uranium equities, and yet the price hasn't moved yet. And it's going to for the reasons that John explained. So I call it the uranium boom boom, which probably isn't, for nuclear, it's not something you want to be throwing around. But over to you.
Really, we should have realised what was going to happen with U2 and supporting nuclear from the very start. It's in the clue's in the name, isn't it? Really, that they think it's going to double in uranium demand.
That's exactly right.
Siobhan, Mike mentioned that key moment in December. That suggests 92 Energy had their timing superb, because you listed at the beginning of this year. Was that listing designed to capture something that you'd seen in the market around a new sentiment towards uranium?
Yeah, look, I think the decarbonisation message that is out there in the globe at the moment is a very important one, and nuclear certainly has to be part of that conversation. And so I recognise, there's a looming shortfall of supply, but then there's also this great sentiment which is sort of forming future demand going forward. So it made for perfect timing for something like 92 Energy to list, being the first exploration company in 10 years to list on the ASX. So I think we've captured a good time to list, and obviously we've got some great projects as well to hopefully explore and find something going forward.
Brandon, do you share the same sentiment? Again, similar to Mike and to John, you've had a project that you've been marketing and promoting for a long time. Is your approach and also the reception you get changed in the last 6 months?
Look, there's no question the reception has changed enormously. 5 years ago, when I was putting commentary out into the public domain, a lot of the time there'd be one Google search every 3 weeks. Now you've got like 10 articles a day and on big mastheads. So there's an awareness generally amongst the investing public and the public at large that nuclear's got to play a much bigger role. And I think for me, there's a demand side which is really changing, and it's changing towards the second half of this decade. But this is an investor story driven by supply. And for the reasons that John described, there's been a huge underinvestment in supply capacity in this sector. It's the underinvestment that we see as public capital market operators. We see the difficulties that companies like ourselves have had raising capital to spend on exploration and development. But what's even more telling is that the development expenditure by the majors has absolutely fallen off a cliff. And these are the companies that, in a well-functioning market, are able to deliver significant pounds into a market when it calls for it, because they've got internal financing, they've got the capability, they can bring mines on. And Cameco hasn't invested in exploration in years. You can track the Kazatomprom development spend, and in 4 years that's dwindled to effectively nothing. Orano are only just starting to invest again in exploration in Greenland, which is kind of a little bit comical now, and also Uzbekistan. So the big engine drivers that would normally be a feature of a supply recovery are not only idling, they've been parked off in the garage and they've forgotten to check the oil for 10 years. So they're just not going to get started very easily. And then you can look at what's visible, particularly what's on public capital markets, and there's a handful of projects well represented on this stage, another handful that aren't on this stage, and then it's a long time frame before you're going to have mines that are capable of delivering into that. Against that, you've got supply depletion, which is, of course, a cyclical aspect of any commodity cycle and any commodity. But in uranium, it's been particularly acute because the supply depletion that we're seeing over the next 5 to 10 years is actually the consequence of the bear market before this bear market. And you've got 4 of the world's top 10 uranium mines that will cease producing by the end of this decade. In fact, 2 have already done that, Ranger and the Cominac mines in Niger. But more significantly, the big dominant supplier in this sector, Kazatomprom and Kazakhstan, a number of their ISR mines start to taper off and close. And probably the quote that sums it all up is Riaz Rizvi, who was the former chief commercial officer of Kazatomprom. He said that by 2040, we're going to need 6 new Kazatomproms to fill that demand growth and the supply depletion. And that is enormous, considering that Kazatomprom represent 25% of today's market.
John, just on Brandon's point, how then is the Australian industry, as represented by the companies on here and a handful of others, how well placed are we to respond to that supply drop off? I mean, it's an industry as a whole that hasn't built a mine in a very long time, and there can't be many professionals out there who have built mines. It's difficult in uranium to get an operation up and running. Are we ready to respond to this supply gap?
There are 2 issues here. First of all, the industry is run or supplied by major sort of believed groups. The Rios, the BHPs, Anglos, Orano, you name it, and lately, in the last 10 years, Kazatomprom. So that industry will not survive by a bunch of small individual companies. The Rio exit is an enormous vacuum that's happening in terms of the seriousness of supply, the guarantee of that supply, and the longevity of that supply. And so these companies offer these consumers, with their $1 trillion of investment, they can't conceive to say, well, look, I'm not going to be supplied here. So now comes the problem. The problem is that with Rio exiting out, that's a vacuum. With Kazatomprom, that in the end, together with Paladin, filled that vacuum by Kazatomprom coming in with 40 million pounds extra, Paladin with about 8. And that was only two groups that actually, of many, committed to doing it. So I think companies, there has to be a sector consolidation. There has to be groups that emulate the majors with pipelines and all of that. And it's not just, I've got a deposit 10 years and I'll surprise. They're all right, that's good, that's a benefit to everybody, but there is something basically missing in the supply sector which few people sort of talk about. On top of that, add the enormous sort of need for expertise, particularly not just in the whole gamut of working with uranium. It's a different commodity. People have got different, sort of interest in the thing. They thwart, they support. You've got to be at the top of your game, and I would say that that's probably one of the reasons of the last era of a small junior. Paladin was the only one that succeeded, with everybody talking they were going to do it. So there's got to be some difficulty there with people acknowledge, and once that acknowledgement is made, you can start repairing the sector. And there's nothing wrong with a sector not being prepared. It can't have done anything for 10 years. People have exited out of the system, gone into other commodities. Some of them will never come back. So get coherent teams together, which has really been one of my main focuses, because the next era is going to be building mines, ensuring supply, and differentiating amongst the others, those companies that can deliver on that. So that's where I see it.
Mm. Mike, in just about every other commodity possible, we hear about WA's advantages as a tier 1 jurisdiction. That is a bit more complicated when it comes to uranium, given state government attitudes towards uranium development. Is VIMI prepared and capable of responding to that supply, given what John said about expertise, and also what Brandon said about where exploration is occurring in essentially higher risk jurisdictions?
Yeah, so you're referring to the approvals process in WA. So we were one of the 4 projects that was approved before Mark McGowan's government was elected in 2017. We received a ministerial statement which lasts, there's a 5-year window to start work on the project, and we've just raised $27.5 million, and part of that will go towards starting work on the project. So once we've done that, we've ticked the last box, so we have social license to operate going forward. Julian Tapp, who's here today and has been doing the approvals, hasn't seen an asymmetry towards those approvals, towards us, to other companies he's worked for. Approvals in WA are problematic now. And we also have a project in the Northern Territory, Alligator River, which is early stage, but it gives us the pipeline that John refers to, and it's really important, particularly talking to utilities. And I think the Northern Territory is certainly, having had Ranger operate, and we're not in Kakadu, we're across in, the ducks are quacking. We're across in Arnhem Land. So our approvals process, while in WA it is very onerous, the flip side is that the standards that we have in this country are very high. So in terms of environmental standards, and that's one of the ticks that we get. And you're starting to see a lot more emphasis on ESG investment. And I think Namibia is certainly, because I was a founding member of Bannerman, founding director, and I know Namibia is a great jurisdiction, Canada is a great jurisdiction, Quebec probably not so much. And so is Australia. So we're in 3 of the best jurisdictions in the world for getting this supply into the market.
Siobhan, not only jurisdiction, but as John mentioned, that pipeline of projects, that suggests things that need to come online 10 years from now when current reserves are running out. Again, looking back to the rationale behind the 92 Energy float and the entry onto the market, was that part of the investment case that you'd be able to fill a gap that currently is looking very sparse in that decade from now?
Yeah, sure. That's certainly the hope and desire of the team. to go out there and explore and find potentially the next Husab or the next Arrow out there. That would be the ideal, obviously. But yes, the timing is crucial for that, because sort of 10 years down the track where supply starts to dry up, you really need those new mines starting to come on. So you need this exploration at this point in time to go out there and make some discoveries, and then it takes sort of about 10 years for those to come into fruition once you make a discovery as an operating mine.
Brandon, Mike mentioned the jurisdictional risk, and he mentioned Namibia, and he mentioned Canada. Namibia has probably got a better track record than any country in the last 15 years. Paladin have got into production under John's stewardship. Siobhan mentioned Husab and the extract story there, which was a wonderful, successful story. And of course, Deep Yellow and Bannerman as well have been successful in exploration there. Does jurisdictional risk become more important in this next decade as companies go looking for new supply sources?
Yeah, look, it absolutely does. And we've seen that already. We've seen the likely ban of uranium mining in Greenland, which has stranded a very large byproduct deposit. We've seen uranium bans in Sweden, which has stranded quite a significant uranium vanadium deposit. We've seen a lot of difficulties with uranium and other forms of mining in Spain and other parts of Europe. And the thing that makes it really interesting is, unlike other commodities, copper or gold, to export uranium from a country, you rely on a huge degree of government support and multilateral support back to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And if you're looking at a developing country, you're relying on government capability that you can't necessarily take for granted. And nuclear physics and radiation safety and these concepts are not straightforward. And we've seen it in Namibia, and John knows this well, where as an industry, we've had to put a number of promising young students through PhDs and other things so that they could then evolve into government and sit on the government side of being able to be an effective regulator. And we've got this interesting parallel development in ESG, where on the one hand, ESG and green finance and decarbonisation are massive drivers for this sector. Cannot be underestimated, particularly when you start to push up against some of the shortcomings of storage, and the fact that as miners, we know that storage ultimately comes out of the ground if it's not pumped hydro, so the price is going to go up dramatically over the next decade. So on the one hand, ESG and all of the things associated with decarbonisation are a huge driver for uranium. But on the other hand, the flip side of that ESG movement is tighter standards, greater expectations, more requirements on companies and developers and host communities. So we, as an industry, need to find a way of meeting this enormous increasing demand for uranium and clean energy whilst being holier than thou in the way that we do it. So coming back to your question about jurisdiction, it means finding new mines and developing new mines in countries that have never exported uranium before is a greater and greater challenge. And John's one of the only people in the world who've done that with the development of Kailikera in Malawi. And, I think John will tell you that was a very significant challenge. And a large part of the solution to that challenge was the fact that Paladin was in Namibia, could use Paladin's infrastructure as an export route, which made that significantly easier.
John, did you have any comments to make on Malawi?
So I think getting Malawi, which was basically artisan mining, no understanding of complex, even a modern gold mine or whatever it might be, and trying to educate a country in terms of what they needed to know to participate on a uranium mine in country, you virtually had to educate them while negotiating with them. And I don't think there are many companies that are able to do that unless they've got that depth of understanding, that huge knowledge that they can provide to those people. And I would not do it again. I would not go into a country that has no uranium mining history. And don't forget, Malawi was the only country that a mine started in the last 40 years, because all other mines started in uranium mining jurisdictions. Nobody has started a mine in a non-mining jurisdiction. So the non-uranium mining jurisdiction. So this sort of expertise limitation doesn't then only affect the execution, construction and building and operating, but also in the preparatory stage of the enormous commitment you need to get a non-uranium country into the business. And I don't think they will provide much future supply for a long time.
Mike, can I turn? Let's have a look at the demand side then. It feels like since before Fukushima, the idea that there's more than 400 reactors being built around the world has been a number that's sort of been sat there for a long time. Where are we on the actual demand side for uranium going into that nuclear power sector? Has there been structural change in that last decade that we've sort of forgotten about uranium?
Well, Brandon will be able to dive into more details. So Brandon's actually on the WNA committee for the demand side, and Julian's on the committee for the supply side. So you've got two of the people writing the WNA report here today, and we can dive into that. But basically, there's a real difference between the OECD countries that have democracies and the countries that don't have democracies. So the builds are coming out of China, they're coming out of the Middle East. I mean, I think Baqara has put the second reactor online. So they're building, the UAE is building 5.6 gig of power. 25% of their power is going to be nuclear. A lot of people don't know that. Pretty much on time, on budget. And that's because the OECD countries, you have electoral cycles that go left, right, left, right, left, right. Europe, they go left, more left, left, more left. And so what happens is you end up with political headwinds against new builds for gigawatt scale plants, right? And they want to retrofit, they want to be seen to be doing something, because that's what politicians do. I'm going to come in and change things, right? So they change the rules on a nuclear plant, and anybody who's built anything knows that if you change something midstream, change the scope, it just blows the cost and out of the water. And that's what we see in the OECD countries, right? The non-OECD countries, they say, this is the plant we're building. We're going to build a whole bunch of them. Everything is, cookie cut, cookie cut, cookie cut. The costs come down. And if you don't like it, we'll chop your arms off. Now, I'm not saying we should do that. But what I'm saying is that when you have these different political forces, you can't get these big projects going. I mean, look at the King Street rail project in Sydney. What a debacle, right? The future for the OECD countries and Western countries is SMRs, small modular reactors. I think that they'll, towards the end of the decade, at about the time that all the wind and solar farms we just built will come to the end of their life, you'll probably see them coming into possible commercialization. But I think the growth is going to come out of the non-OECD, and we're definitely seeing, Belgium has announced they're shutting down 6 gig. We're going to see decrease, but I think the growth in the non-OECD countries is definitely going to outstrip the decrease in the OECD countries.
Brandon, has Mike got it right there, or has he just made that all up?
Look, I haven't met anyone who's had their arms chopped off for opposing nuclear. So what we're seeing is, I think a year ago, I would have agreed wholeheartedly with Mike. What we are observing in real time right now is an inflection point because of decarbonisation and the specific targets. And I'll tell you how they've worked. There was a time a couple of years ago where a government that's job is just to demonstrate progress and to appease people could simply say, green, we get it, more renewables. Renewables, 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 renewables. Good, that's our job done. And whatever happens with the grid in 10 years' time, I'm going to be retired on my government pension, so who cares? Now what's happened is there's hard targets and there's a degree of accountability that the more forward-thinking politicians and certainly the technocrats and the bureaucrats inside government are grappling with. And we're really seeing this in the way that China did their work ahead of their announcement at the WEF that they would be setting a 2060 decarbonisation target. And that's evolved in real time, as I say, because you can't just push out intermittent renewables now without starting to grapple with what are the 10, 20-year consequences on a grid. Because we've now said, and remember, politicians, they're driven by legacy, which is perhaps a kind way to put it, but the politicians who got there and said 2050, they've now got a legacy to protect. And they want to make sure that that accountability and that carbon counting or electron counting, as it's being called now, actually works in their favour. And that's hugely beneficial for nuclear. and gas for that matter. And, you know, there's a big debate going on about dispatchable gas being built in the Hunter Valley today. So that's an inflection point for the OECD. There are still recalcitrant attitudes which I think are beyond salvation, and the industry has been helped by the enormous energy failures in Germany, and the Energiewende has effectively tripled electricity costs for households and doubled electricity costs for industry without improving emissions. And that should be the poster child to countries like Belgium and anyone else who's gone left, more left, more left, impossibly left, extreme left, that you can't have that sort of an attitude towards energy policy and balance the carbon books in 20 years' time when they need to be. So I've got a renewed hope in OECD. What Mike said about non-OECD, yeah, that is the real driver here. And in particular, China, the growth in nuclear, the official growth targets in nuclear are enormous. The unofficial consequences of their policy in terms of growth of nuclear are at least double that again. And there's reasons why the government doesn't want to lay those out. But as soon as you start scratching the surface back and saying, right, there's your goal to decarbonise the electricity sector by 2050. There's your goal to reach peak electricity by 2035, as China has. And then you look at how much capacity there is to scale hydro, hardly any. What's it going to do to an evolving grid that's got this electrification of everything in China, 1 million new vehicles, electric vehicle targets in so many different cities, all of this, if you're pushing intermittent renewables that don't have effective solar on the, effective storage on the other side. And the answer for China is nuclear. So that's why I say there's an unofficial consequence that's going to come in that I believe will be double the numbers that are being put on reactor construction there.
Thank you. Siobhan, is that message being projected, investors getting that message for a company like 92 Energy that's at the very start of that pipeline?
Oh, look, absolutely. I think investors are really keen on the nuclear energy story and what it potentially can do for the world and decarbonisation. I think nuclear as an industry probably has one of the biggest roles to play in the decarbonisation of the world, and that's really important. And investors see that. They see that this is the new green industry. It's good on ECG levels and etc. So yeah, I'm definitely coming across, everyone's very positive about what nuclear can do in relation to that story of decarbonisation for sure.
Mike, investors are getting very active. We've seen Sprott Asset Management this week dive into the physical market. You've got a lot of money in the bank now. Is that something that you would look to do, buy physical uranium?
No, so we're still, a good CEO always says this, but we're still undervalued. When you look at the metrics against our peers, you know, enterprise value to net asset value, enterprise value to resources, we still have a lot of growth in our share price. So from an investor point of view, you want to protect the investors. You don't want to dilute to buy uranium if there's more upside in your share price, which is the case with us. I just want to comment on that. So Sprott hasn't come into the market yet. We'll park that for a second. But we just had Denison, Boss, and a company called Encore buying uranium. And they've got reasons for that. And certainly some of the investors, particularly in the United States, like that they've done that. But they missed a really interesting opportunity, right? Because they went into the spot market, but the spot market isn't a true spot market like we see with copper, nickel, iron ore, when it used to have still a spot market. But what they didn't do, they didn't sit in the market with the money they'd raised and buy the available uranium on the day. They didn't do price discovery. What they did was they just secured uranium on the forward spot curve going forward. I mean, I think some of the deliveries might even go in a year from now, which isn't even spot. But I know Denison is from April this year till October. So all they've done is done forward sales. They haven't created the price discovery, right? Sprott will. So Sprott is going to be a unit trust. And so what happens with Sprott is when this money comes in from the investors, I think the way the mechanism is going to work is they've got 30 days to buy uranium. And so what we're actually going to see, depending on how much money comes in, is Sprott's got, I mean, they're a big company and they've got access to a lot of capital. We may actually see a true spot market. We may actually see true price discovery. So it's not something we'll do. We haven't got the balance sheet for a start. And I think a Sprott is going to be a game changer. I think it's going to be really interesting when they set that up. I think they're probably 6 months away. Because the only two things will make the spot price go up, and that's true price discovery in the spot market, buying it on the day, leaving the bid in the market, or on the other side because it is an arbitrage market, spot market, where we're seeing the contract cycle take off again. And that's certainly what happened in the last run-up, is you actually saw the contract market improve before the spot price did. It followed the contract price up because it's an arbitrage market. So Sprott's a game changer. We've never seen anything like it before.
Mm. John?
Yeah, so I've got quite a bit to say on this. I feel like I've been on the moon, and I can tell you what it's like there. And everybody else has got microscope, whatever they call telescopes, and say that's what it feels like to be there. Juniors buying uranium is a total goddamn waste of money. It really is, and it's fashionable, and they buy £1 million, and it's different with the UPC weaponising that with they're the sort of ETF warehouses, yellow cake. But these bloody juniors that get onto the fashion board, where that 60 million or 80 million should go is in developing, getting more resources, getting the footprint and preparing for supply. We went and in Paladin, I didn't buy one bloody pound. We just trusted our judgment we could supply. We went to £8 million. Yes, there is that sort of transition from zero producer, but it's just the simplistic people that haven't produced, don't know what it is to produce, and say, "Oh, jingo, I'm going to buy some pounds." And it does nothing for the shareholder in terms of getting those pounds out of the ground and putting them out in the market and confident that they can do that. If you're not confident, buy pounds. There are other ways of offsetting that risk. So this is where I think the ignorance of the sector is aberrating and doing things where maybe it shouldn't be doing.
Thank you, John. I knew it wouldn't take long to get controversial comments on this panel. We've got flat earth suggestions from Mike about Dumas House, and now John with buying of physical uranium. I've done enough work for a little bit. It's time for you to sing for your lunch and ask some questions. Have we got any questions from the floor? Both Mel and Kate are walking around with microphones. I know they seem a bit scary. They're not that scary, though. Well, I'll come back then. Siobhan, a point I missed earlier that I should have interjected on was differing attitudes towards uranium. This probably comes back to Mike's comment about flat earth science. Australia has had a fraught relationship, to say the least, with uranium and nuclear power for as long as we can remember. You've picked up ground in Canada. What's public perceptions of uranium and nuclear in Canada? Do you find that an easier social license to gather?
Look, I think Canada has had many, many years of uranium mining. So they're very pro-uranium mining. Obviously, there's some big mines that are already operating over there and some huge deposits that are in the development phase as well. But also just in general, they've got a more positive attitude towards nuclear. Part of their electricity grid is run with nuclear power. And, you know, even the traditional owners, for example, are quite positive on small modular reactors. I think recently there was an MOU done between some traditional owners in the hope that they could potentially operate some of those small modular reactors going forward. So it just shows a completely different attitude to what we have in Australia. And I think it's both on the mining side as well as the operational side to have nuclear as a source of green electricity for Canada going forward. So quite different.
Mike, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think Siobhan's made a great choice. Choice, yeah. Great point in that Canada has a long history of nuclear power. So, and nuclear research, and that's really important. Going to John's point, you know, we talk about having a nuclear submarine fleet here. We just haven't got the technology. We haven't got the people. We can skill up. It would take 20 or 30 years. But I think what happened in Australia, and this doesn't get a lot of airplay, but it's just my theory, is that because we had nuclear weapon testing in Australia and in the Pacific, people conflate nuclear power with nuclear weapons. Always. It's one of the things you hear from the anti-nuke people. And I think the fact that we had weapons testing here may have been the tipping point against nuclear power in Australia. It's just, look, nobody's ever done research, but that's the feeling I get having come from Canada.
Is there, you mentioned inflection point in the building of the nuclear fleet in OECD countries, Brandon. Is there any chance that we'll approach an inflection point in Australia in the next 10 years with public perception towards nuclear and uranium?
Look, it's an interesting question for me as a person. Like, as an Australian citizen who, you know, is very passionately Australian, I just really hope so. As a uranium industry person, I couldn't care less. It's a tiny industry in Australia. There's tiny potential. It doesn't move the needle whatsoever. It's kind of cool to go to conferences around the world where people feel sorry for you because you come from this land where people don't understand science. But on the more serious point, we really need it. Australia desperately needs it. And I'll tell you why. If we start projecting a couple of decades forward, Australia's at great risk of falling on the wrong side of two critical judgment points in history. The first one is the morality boundary when it comes to decarbonisation. And if you approach it from a futuristic point of view, that might become more than a morality boundary, and it might become a trade boundary. Particularly if you see large economies like China achieve their decarbonisation goals, we should expect as a country that if we don't follow suit, there will be tariffs, there will be other trade barriers thrown up against us, both at a national level and at an industry level. That's a given. Now, the other one is the energy poverty barrier. And that is the consequence for future generations of very poor decision-making in energy policy today and over the next 10 years. If we go and we build this dream of 100% renewables, we are simply conceiving and entering a gestation period for energy poverty that my children will inherit in 20 years' time, because grid stability for a developed country is an absolute non-negotiable, essential, taken for granted aspect of everyday life and everyday industry. And that is not compatible with intermittent renewables at a large degree of penetration. I'm quite happy with it, 15, 20% of a normal grid. But at a large degree of penetration, it's totally incompatible with grid stability. I've already expressed my views on storage. The cost will go up dramatically. There's a lot of dots that still need to be joined on hydrogen, and they're not going to be joined quickly. And for other countries that don't have a political bias or a legal bias against nuclear, nuclear offers a very, very sound, cost-effective and environmentally effective solution that provides that stability that will offset intermittent renewables. Even if it's only 10 or 20% of the grid, it can still keep a country away from pushing over the line of future energy poverty. And until we change the law here and change our attitudes and start to think a little bit over the horizon, we're at great risk of falling on the wrong side of one or both of those barriers. It's possible we could be the world pariah and have instability in our electricity grid. And that seems to be the way that energy policy is going at the moment in this country. So on this stage, as an exporter, I never expect in my wildest dreams I'll be exporting uranium to Australia, and I couldn't care less. But as a citizen and someone who deeply believes in this country, I'm worried. I'm very worried for my children that we're making the wrong decisions right now.
Thanks, Brendan. We're out of time. I can squeeze in one question if somebody's actually going to try now. We've got one from another Paydirt colleague, so that There's still going to be one more because I want somebody to ask one. Come on.
It's actually not from me, it's from the live stream. So can you ask John and Brandon, due to the neurality of their two projects, if they see any value of the two companies jointly sharing information, geology mapping, and perhaps funds for development of shared infrastructure, roads, rail communications, etc. That's from Calculated Punt.
I just want to get my. I need my phone.
Look, I think it's always good for companies to talk and share whatever can be shared within the competitive regime that they work in. But it's just the same as asking Mike next door to me, why doesn't he combine with Toro? And there's an advantage there to talk. It's the same state. So I don't think that question is valid in that sense. There might be other considerations of people. And as I said, I've always talked about that any company that thinks it will be like it is today in 5 years' time, it's out of the race. It's just got its single deposit. At that time when these deposits are running, by the way, the uranium price will be whatever you want to imagine it to be. But what it is then is that there'll be no opportunity for that company to get another project in the pipeline. A realistic project, not a sort of one that you talk about and say, oh, well, this will happen. So there's enormous need to sort of revamp. And I just want to get back to this sort of regulated EU sitting there with their heads in the sand, run by the Germans who are really going into the renewable phase and trying to control everything. Eventually, these are the countries, also the developed countries, that want to stop building the internal combustion engine by 2035. The amount of electricity more that will be needed is enormous. And it won't be able to be provided by intermittent energy. They won't allow gas to come in. So nuclear becomes the imperative. It's not what people are thinking about today that will determine how these policies will be. It will be when their backs are in the corner. They can't provide those very things that their population provide. Politicians will start seeing. It'll be a bit later than sooner. A classic case is this WNA thing. They're really a strange organisation, and no, honestly, and I've actually had a 20-year history with these bastards, and I believe they're a sort of self-serving group of middle-rank managers that try and sort of predict the future. There's nobody there that runs industries that are there as the decision makers. And so we'll end up with we've got a sort of and they do a good job within the limitations, but we've got these sort of forward projections to 2040, in 2019, the thing. And these don't visualise the future at all, because it's a policy that drives planned and proposed reactors. Those proposed reactors and planned don't see the decarbonisation. All they see was electrification and getting these sort of numbers up where the bloody Europeans, just comfortable in their sort of socialistic slot, and then saying, oh, we're okay, sonny boy, we've got enough electricity. And we're not in this equation. This is in 2019, 2015. Now, in 2021, 2025, they'll say, bloody hell, we need more power, because you cannot decarbonise without more power. And Germany has shown that renewables, no matter the wonderful engineers they are, they can't make it get to work. So that's where, and I think that these early moves and everything you're reading today is really not the reality. That's yet to be identified. But everybody is starting to say, hell, renewables have got a limitation. They are really an integral part, but for 5 hours, 6 hours a day, what happens to the other 16? And you're putting an enormous load for storage, and you need other types of energy to mobilise. I think hydrogen or whatever it is will be something of the future. There's heavy haulage. So we are in a transition period where you have to be You have to believe in certain things happening, and your strategy of your company is focused on that and not what you're reading. Even though what you're reading is pretty darn good. But there's other structural things that have to be made in the sector. It's a beleaguered sector, really, honestly. It's just a consequence of history. And a lot of companies have to put their fingers on their head and say, what are we going to do to muscle up, get into a situation where you become a significant player with significant voice in that sort of marketing, supply side. There's not going to be another Kazatomprom. It's going to come from all over the place. And this is where I think that it's a fantastic sector with great opportunity.
I think we need to give Brandon both a right of reply by calling him and his colleagues at the World Nuclear Agency
Well, I
bunch
called
of
it, by
bastards.
the way, on note as the worst nuclear association. and I'm on record as that. And I see now there's some sort of younger players coming in, and I see some hope, but it's driven by... You don't you reckon? Yep. Yes, and it's driven... Good on you. And my mate.
So let's...
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, until Brandon, and I remember Brandon asked us to nominate him to get onto the committee. Julian went on the committee. I mean, before that, it was run by EDF, Electricity de France. They would just, on the supply side or the demand side, they would just say, this is what's going to happen. This is it. Suck it up. So it was a very political organization. John's quite right. Until we had some young people coming into it, bringing outside ideas. I mean, even on one of the committees now, we've got an investor out of the States, out of Segra Capital. They're on the WNA. So now you're starting to see some lateral thinking. But yeah, I mean, the first time we went to a WNA gig in London, I thought, Jesus, I don't even know the secret handshake. It was like being, honestly, it was like the Templar Knights. It really was.
Brandon, on behalf of the WNA, will that perception change over the next few years? And then also, John's denied he'll be buying, Deep Yellow will be buying Bannerman. The question remains from our live streamer, when will Bannerman be taking over Deep Yellow?
But I think Calculated Punt is well aware that there's still enough lawyer in me to know not to answer that question. And John, it's very kind of you to include me as a young person. So I assume I'm one of the people who are slowly making WNA better. What I would say is WNA is the umbrella trade industry for this industry, umbrella trade organisation for this industry. And one of the challenges is that there aren't too many pure play nuclear electricity providers who sit at that table. Most of them provide nuclear electricity, they've got fossil fuel in the form of gas and coal, and increasingly they've got intermittent renewables as part of their energy mix. So it's very hard to motivate an organisation like that to stand up and call a spade a shovel, which is what we've been doing from this platform, but it's politically taboo to criticise renewable energy, whether it's justified or not. The average man or woman on the street truly in their heart believes that we will be 100% intermittent renewable, and the only thing getting between us and that outcome is politically will and those horrible people who work in fossil fuels. And we know that energy is not that simple. But where an organisation like WNA, if it was run pure blood nuclear, could play a role, is to call it as nonsense. But it's hard to do that when some of your members get 50% of their revenue from intermittent renewables, and that's just the nature of the challenge. I obviously don't go to the pubs late enough because I haven't met the bastards that John's talking about, but it's a big organisation, so I look forward to that diversity.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
So let me tell you what the WNA is. The WNA represents the whole nuclear industry from the cradle to the grave. And it has all the, transport, geology, mining, nuclear reactors, vendors. Vested interests are completely in there.
So of any conference that you go to, of a 2-3 day conference, the supply sector gets 2 hours. I was going to use the F word then, but I won't. Damn. Two bloody hours. In any other commodity, and this is where people don't realise, there used to be a producers' association, which was the real engine of people talking about mining, the difficulties of mining, and allowing a 2-day conference to happen. Well, now that's railroaded. You tell me any other industry that has an iron ore industry that has the automakers there, that has the scrap dealers there. Another F word nearly, because it's bloody bullshit to have this sort of encompassing organisation where the voice of the producers and the potential producers and what's facing them to be recognised in reality, and dedicate that, and not to a 30-minute bloody talk at a conference where everybody forgets about it because there are trillions of dollars loaded into the reactor component, and probably now about $20 billion in the sort of supply side. That's all of the companies in the world. So this is the mismatch that happens. This is the bloody problem that, and nobody talks about. Where are the producers in here? Now, there's the antitrust rules that came in, and that sort of forced people to, they couldn't get together and talk about things. But there has to be a debate how the industry as a global entity can talk about bloody supply and exploration and the issues of that, and the expertise and the schooling and the engineers that you need, and that doesn't happen in the worst nuclear association. and that's because a lot of people are gone that used to know all of this, and the young pups just accept it as it is. So there has to be an evolution there.
Thanks, John. Yeah. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so you've done the right thing by the audience, and nobody will have to ask a question. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed what's been a fascinating, full of insight, conversation full of insight and a few giggles as well. So thank you very much for joining us. Can you just join me in thanking our panellists up here? They've done a wonderful job. I'm sure all of our panellists will be hanging around to have another glass of wine and catch up with people. So if you need to catch any of our panellists, I'm sure they're all available. And please continue. The drinks will keep flowing, so please don't feel like we're kicking you out by any means. We'll be back next month with another Paydirt Unlocked, where we'll be unlocking a slightly less controversial topic. It'll be the nickel sector. We'll have a number of nickel miners and nickel explorers on the programme, so please join us again for that one. But I think we'll just thank our panellists one last time. Thank you again to Brandon, Siobhan, Mike and John. And please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.